And he answered and said, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. So what's that original message? What's the original gospel? It's that simple. It's that Jesus is the Son of God. And I don't know how many times, we use that phrase and we talk about it all the time. But just let that kind of sink in. Jesus is God. Jesus is the Son of God. And so God sent His Son to live with us. He didn't have to. Just think about that. Our Creator sent Jesus to live with us. And some of the created don't believe that. Paul keeps going in verse 6. And he expresses his surprise. He says it. He said, I am amazed that you are so quickly deserting Him who called you. Kind of dripping with sarcasm. Paul's basically saying, you're leaving the one who saved you. You're leaving Jesus. Paul might have been a Chiefs fan. We bring in a coach and we say, this coach is the Savior of the Chiefs. Then about 6 months later, we fire him and get another one. That's kind of what Paul's saying here. He's saying, I'm surprised that you're so quickly abandoning the one who you claim to be the initial Savior in Jesus for a different gospel. This doesn't make sense. To give you a little background of what was happening here. So Paul had come into the Galatians and he had started this church and he had brought this good news, the gospel. And so Paul was on a missionary journey. So after he left the Galatians, he went on to a different community. And some people came in behind him called Judaizers. And they were Jewish Christians. And so what they would do after Paul left is because they still enjoyed the Jewish tradition and the Jewish law. So Paul sets up this church and leaves. And the Judaizers come in and say, Paul gave you kind of a watered-down version of Jesus. Let us fill in the blanks. And so the first thing, it's not all about grace and love. You have to have tradition. So the first thing you got to do is be circumcised, because Paul had went to Gentiles, non-Jewish people. And so these Jewish Christians said, you got to be circumcised, you've got to only walk so many days on the Sabbath, you've got to do the proper sacrifices, you've got to go to the temple. They brought all these Jewish traditions back. And in response, Paul writes this letter. In response, Paul's saying, the original gospel of just Jesus, you've added to it with the Jewish tradition. There's a certain type of contract that most general contractors go after. And it's called a cost plus. So I'll explain. Whenever someone calls me to do for a project, I go out, I meet with them, I get a set of plans, or they tell me the design, and I take that set of plans back and I figure up, how many 2x4s do we need, how many nails, how many man hours. I call the electrician, I call all the subs, and I put together an estimate or a bid, and then I present it to whoever the owner is. Now, this is like a best guess, a bid is. It's kind of a science and an art. You have a set of plans or an idea of what you're building, but you don't know if it's going to rain. You don't know if you've overlooked some of the material, if it's going to take guys longer or shorter to do the work. It's a little bit of a risk. So that's how most things operate. There's this other type of contract, though, that's called a cost plus. And so in the same scenario, owner calls you up, but they've decided to already use me. And so they would call me up and say, I want you to build me a house. But we're going to do cost plus. So they pay for everything. They pay for my time. They pay for all the material. They pay the true cost of what that project is. And then at the end, the plus part is profit and material, or overhead and profit. So they paid for everything, and then they paid 10 or 20% on top of it. That's a really good scenario because there's no risk. You can't lose. They're going to pay for everything and then give you an additional 10 or 20%. Paul's kind of saying that's what these people are doing with Jesus. They want the plus. They want to add something to it. They're taking Jesus and they're saying, Jesus is fine, but now add circumcision. Jesus is fine, but now don't eat these certain types of food. Jesus paid for everything, but you got to add to it. And Paul's writing them in response saying, if you add anything to Jesus, it's no longer the original gospel. It's not a both and. It's an either or. It's either Jesus or it's the wrong gospel. But you can't add to something that's already been paid for. Paul goes now into verse 8. And as he continues through this, I think he's pretty frustrated at this point. And he tells them, even if I myself or an angel from God comes to you and tells you a gospel, a message different than the one we first brought you, why would you go with that? He appeals to their logical side. He says, if you changed your whole life to follow Jesus, and now someone else is coming in and saying you need to add to it, that just doesn't make sense. Why would the thing you're following now not work anymore? Why would Jesus need anything added to it? Well, at the end of verse 10, he goes into this whole thing. Am I now pleasing man or am I pleasing God? So what Paul is pointing out is when these Judaizers, when these people who come into the congregation want to add to Jesus, the question that he doesn't ask, but that is there, is what do they gain? What does someone else gain when they add to Jesus? And so what is it that we gain when we add to Jesus? If you look at the church as an organization, as opposed to a spiritual community, the church is the organization. If they add things to Jesus, it could be for the power of a certain individual, it could be for monetary gain, it could be for a political gain. And so that's what Paul's addressing here. He's saying, what are these people who are in the middle of all y'all gaining by adding to Jesus? There's a song that came out in the late 90s by Matt Redman. Chris pointed out the first song we sang was a song written by Matt Redman, and he's a worship leader in a church in England, and the pastor of his church had realized that the worship had become something it wasn't supposed to be. The worship there was a big band on stage and a big light display, a great sound system, and so it had really become this whole this show, this performance. And then on top of that, the congregation then was only coming for this performance. They were only coming for this great show, good music, the light show,